Sup, bozos, what's good? Welcome back to Office Hours with the Professor, the show where I say things. Tonight, the origins of Chinese civilization, part 2, Big Men and Kings, or as I like to call it, Ongka's Big Chinese Moka. So, last time we talked about some of the early cultures along the Yellow River during the Neolithic period, okay? So, Neolithic. And remember, Neolithic is Greek for the New Stone Age, Neolithic stone. And it refers to the period between the dawn of agriculture and the first use of metal tools. So, basically, we're talking about 10 to 3 kya. Remember, kya is my little joke with myself that for 1,000 years ago, I have K-Y-A-K, 1,000 years ago. Kya, 10 to 3 kya was the Neolithic, around that period anyway. And it refers to the period between the dawn of agriculture and the first use of metal tools, okay? And basically we had during this time settled farming villages that were too small to really call a civilization, okay? So farming villages. But we did not have cities, okay? And that's the really important thing to remember. Civilization, I would argue, is culture with cities, okay? And this is not what we would know as civilization. One of the most important of these societies is called the Yang Shao culture by archaeologists, okay? So I think we remember the Yang Shao, or if we don't, maybe we should go back and review the last video, but the Yang Shao culture, okay, Yang Shao culture, and the Yang Shao culture flourished in north central China during the 5th century BC or around 7 kya, okay? So, the 5th millennium BC, 7 kya, all right, and this was the heyday of the Yang Shao culture, and by the 3rd millennium BC, it had developed into what is known as the Long Shan culture. Now, this is not to be confused with the Hong Shan culture that we talked about last time. This is the Long Shan culture, okay? And the Long Shan culture, it flourished between 5 and 4 kya, all right, in the Yellow River Basin. So we're talking about 3,000 to 2,000 BC. Now, during the second half of the development of the Longshan culture, there existed, for the first time in China, what we might have called civilization. That is, a culture with cities. A culture with cities. My marker's dying. I missed it. Maybe do a new one. Here we go. A culture with cities. Okay. Now we cannot really call this the beginning of Chinese history because, you know, as I've been saying, written documents from this time do not exist, or at least we haven't found them yet. Okay. So, but this is the first emergence of what we would call Chinese civilization, okay? Now, all the foundations for future historical development, right, were in place by the end of the Longshan period. And in traditional Chinese historiography, the period between 5 and 4,000 years ago, it was this larger than life time of like heroic badasses. Like in traditional Chinese historiography, it's known as the time of the 3 sovereigns. Sorry. And 5 emperors. All right, and the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors were these larger-than-life heroes like the Yellow Emperor and Dai Yu, and you remember my man Dai Yu. They got up to all sorts of heroic badassery, and it could even be that these myths are in fact folk memories of actual events and maybe even people from the Longshan period. Maybe not, but it is fun to speculate, okay? So at any rate, the Longshan period, in my view, is really where the China ball started not just rolling, but picking up speed. And by this I mean that the distinctly Chinese cultural elements that we discussed last time now existed in a stratified urban society. Okay, and regardless of whether the language of the Longshan people was ancestral to modern Chinese, although it may very well have been, the culture certainly was. This is Chinese culture that we're observing in the Longshan period. So as this new civilization grew, villages became cities, hundreds became thousands, then tens of thousands. The result of this population growth, as in other ancient civilizations, was increased social stratification. Okay, so let's write this down. Social stratification. In the Longshan period. A priestly ruling class governed, and being part of this priestly ruling class meant some pretty sweet perks. For one thing, you got to have these bitchin' parties with tons of booze, ostensibly to honor your ancestors. Now, the drink of choice, and let's write this down because they threw some pretty good parties. Lots of parties, okay? And ostensibly, these parties were to honor their ancestors. Now, and what did they drink at these parties? They did not drink natty ice. They drank, or even PBR. What they drank was not unlike Huangzhou, okay? Huangzhou, and I like Huangzhou. It's pretty good. Huangzhou, all right? Huangzhou, in which what this really is yellow rice beer. And it's still drunk in China today, okay? It's widely enjoyed in China today. Actually, at home I have a bottle that I use for cooking. It's really nice. The strong emphasis, at any rate, on partying by the ruling class during the early millennia of Chinese history is particularly interesting when viewed in comparison with other cultures' tradition of the big man. Here we go. This is important. Other cultures' traditions of the big man. Okay? Now, to this day, among some Papuan and Austronesian speakers of the South Seas, societies tend to be nominally egalitarian, but in reality, things are run by the local big man, who everyone respects as the de facto leader. You know, when I was in Anthro 101, and this is something that happens to every Anthro 101 student, you watch a documentary from the 70s called Ongka's Big Moka, and you know what I'm talking about if you have taken an Anthro 101 class, because it's all about the big man society, and it's all about one of the big men trying to advance his position. And so I always think of Ongka and his big Moka every time I think of these ancient civilizations, big man societies, because I think Ongka would not have felt out of place in some of these cultures. So this position of the big man, what is a big man? A big man position is maintained by A, giving gifts to your neighbors, and B, throwing awesome parties, okay? So anyone who wants to become the next big man has a simple task. What is that task? Throw a more epic kegger than the last guy, okay? So friendly competition between big men is of course highly encouraged in these societies, since the ones who benefit most are the neighbors and the friends of the big men. The institution of the big men is central to many, if not most, cultures of the South Seas. You know, let's move away from China for a little while, just for a second, don't worry, and let's take a look at Papua New Guinea. Okay, PNG, and one of the official languages of Papua New Guinea is this. Tok Pisin. I love Tok Pisin. It's such a cool language. It's a Creole language that's spoken, as I say, in Papua New Guinea. And in this language, okay, the word for example, president is Bigman Blom Country. That is, big man belong country, or the big man of the country. Okay, so that I think shows some of the prominence in the culture of the big man. Okay, now on the other hand, in the Tok Pisin language, the thing that you don't want to be is the likikman, or the small man. Now, the big man society appears to be a fairly natural development in the emergence of sedentary societies the world over, especially those that are horticultural or small-scale agricultural. Now, these guys are not agricultural, but you might consider the potlatch of the Pacific Northwest Indians, right? Or even the term big man appears in different times, places, and languages, referring always to a man who is not physically large, but rather socially influential. In ancient Sumer, for example, ancient Sumer, which of course was in Mesopotamia, the earliest kings were known as Lugal. And what does Lugal mean? Literally, it translates to, you guessed it, big man. Now, I've always wondered if this term Lugal was like a holdover from the very earliest days of sedentary agricultural life, when a big man society actually did exist. So, coming back to China, as populations grew, big men became chieftains, chieftains became kings, and in ancient China, okay, the proper way to address a male member of the nobility or a nobleman was this. Daren, and these days in colloquial vernacular standard Chinese it just means adult, but historically it meant something like my lord or my liege, okay? And a Daren translates literally to what? Big man. Now, I don't know how long this has been used, but it would be very interesting if this term was present from the earliest stages of the Chinese language. Now, the antonym to this, of course, is what? You guessed it. Xiaoren, which is small man. And what is the real meaning of this is villain. So the lord, your lordship is Daren, but the villain, and of course etymologically villain. Well, anyway, we don't need to get into the etymology of villain, but it did not refer to someone who was a lord, and even today it refers to a criminal, right? So Xiaoren is a small man, right? So compare both of these terms, Daren, Xiaoren, with the Tok Pisin, Bigman, and Liklikman. Okay, big man, small man. Now, I don't know when these terms, Daren, Xiaoren, were first used, but if they were present in the very earliest written Chinese documents, I can't help but wonder if they're holdovers from the Long Shan period, which is a time when city chieftains and kings had been, just a few generations before, village big men. Indeed, traditional Chinese histories remember the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors of the extremely remote, but not necessarily completely legendary past, right? Now, these 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors did not necessarily follow a hereditary dynastic succession. Now, doesn't that sound an awful lot like a big man society, wherein influence is held by an individual but not passed on to that person's children? Very interesting. So during the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors period of traditional Chinese historiography, they talk about the succession not being hereditary. Could this be a very dim recollection of a big man society that existed? I think that's quite possible. You know, and so that's what I think about the big men in Chinese history. That's my hypothesis. That in the Longshan culture, we are seeing a transition from a big man society to a stratified civilization. And we can hear some very faint echoes of that transition in Chinese mythology to this day. So, what do you think? Send me a comment or email. I'd love to discuss this with you guys. Also, be sure to tune in next time for the Origins of Chinese Civilization, Part 3. Something happens. See you next time.
One, two, three, into the folk. Snoop Doggy Dogg and Dr. Dre is at the door.